public spheres. We are looking forward to some brilliant presentations and plenary sessions by Dr. Nilesh Bose, Dr. Ravikanth, and Gautam Liu. Towards the end of the day, we have Professor Gayatri Chakravarti Spivak for her valedictory address. So without wasting a moment, let's start with the first session of the day, paper presentations, 9:30 a.m. to 10:45 a.m. IST. Ruchi, Nagpal, and Aditi are already here with us, so please take the proceedings forward.
Thank you, Meenakshi. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the first session of day 3 of our conference on language ideologies and vernacular in South Asian colonial and post-colonial literature and public sphere. This session is paper presentation. So we have 3 paper presenters with us in this session, Dr. Swatie, Nandini, Kalita, and Shrikanth BR. I hope all the 3 presenters are here. And the session would be chaired by Professor Anuradha Ghosh. Professor Anuradha Ghosh is professor at the Department of English, Jamia Millia, Islamia. Some of her published works include The Politics of Imperialism and Counter Strategies, co-edited by Pratyush Chandra, Anuradha Ghosh, and Ravi Kumar, published by Akar Books in 2004, and Filming Fiction, Tagore, Premchand, and Ray, a volume of critical essays on Satyajit Ray, co-edited with M. Asaduddin and published by Oxford University Press, New Delhi. Welcome, ma'am, and it's over to you now.
Without much ado, I would like to invite the first presentation for the day, and we have 15 minutes for presentation and 10 minutes for question answers. So maybe after 10 minutes of your presentation, I'll give you a nudge so that you can wrap it up. So I'm looking forward to the 3 presentations of the day. The first is by Dr. Swatie, who is assistant professor in LSR College, that is Lady Shri Ram College, Delhi University. And her paper is titled Trauma and the Vernacular, Saadat Hasan Manto's Language Games. So over to you, Swati.
Good morning.
And, just a second, ma'am. We were thinking if we can take all the questions together after all the 3 presenters have presented.
No,
If that's
don't do
fine
that.
with the chair.
No, don't do that. Don't do that.
Okay. Okay.
I'll just dive right into the presentation. Is there a vernacular dimension to trauma? Studies on trauma reveal the historical, collective, and individual aspects of trauma as powerful forces shaping the Western world. Yet, how does trauma play out in local contexts? Can the vernacular framework provide a better understanding to trauma in the context where atrocity is located in non-Western spaces? For this, I turn to the partition is context and critique of Western imports of trauma theory. The writings of the partition lay bare these historical and collective forms of violent encounters. Among the literary voices strongly associated with the partition is writer Saadat Hasan Manto. Are Manto's stories full of trauma? To ask this question is to ask if the collective and individual experience of the partition can be given the label of trauma. Can trauma theory learn from Manto, the great storyteller? Can the world of trauma discourse be reimagined using a different context, a vernacular context? Can trauma theory, therefore, be reformulated through Manto's experience in order to better understand the world of mental injury that the partition created? To understand if there can be a vernacular dimension to trauma and register and cultural import, a brief foray into the world of trauma theory is needed. Trauma has come to us through the Greek word trauma, which implies a mental wound. This traumatic wound is discussed with psychoanalytical theory as the compulsion to repeat the site of traumatic injury. Sigmund Freud discusses this. The quote is on your screens. I won't read the quote for shortage of time, but this statement is at the foundation of trauma theory and is significant for the following reasons. First, it helps us understand trauma as the compulsion to repeat the site of hurt and therefore of the traumatic compulsion to repeat. Second, it is presented as the limit of one discourse and the beginning of another. For Freud, discussing trauma theory happens through the aid of literary discourse instead of psychoanalytic discourse. Third, Freud creates a universal subject of trauma that has a rooting in Western concerns. What he forgets is the grounding of Tasso's tale in the Crusades and the Orientalist implications of it. Next slide. This is Amy Novak talking about Freud's quote And it shows the Anglocentric bias of trauma theory right at the moment of its inception. Thus, the moment of foundation for trauma theory is also the moment of its suppression of the colonial, racial, and cultural other. It has generally been since then well accepted that trauma theory needs to move beyond Tancred and Clorinda in order to help understand transactional realities of non-European others. There have been additions to the understanding of what a local and vernacular traumatic conception of hurt ought to carry. Erik Erikson has, for instance, asserted the importance of culture as an important tool in psychoanalysis and by implication in our understanding of trauma. Erik Erikson has done that, and then Indian psychoanalyst Sudhir Kakkar has also shown how the process of psychoanalysis and therapeutic narration is grounded in a cultural transactional reality. In other words, trauma and its reception in the psyche is a matter of cultural transaction and engagement as well. The narrative component to healing that Freud envisages in the founding tale of Tancred and Clorinda is based on a literary aspect of narration. It can be argued that this literary aspect is not without its linguistic concerns. For Freud, it was the game of faux pas that was related to the compulsion to repeat and reveal the pleasure principle. For somebody like Jacques Lacan, it was the psyche structured like a language. For Kakkar, the cultural framework to traumatic engagement cannot be avoided or seen as separate from a linguistic framework of culture to work through the trauma. This cultural linguistic claim to cultural specificity reveals several insights in the work of Manto the aesthete. Manto had a way to write partition as well as write about the hurt of the partition through a different linguistic literary register. In Manto's stories, there exists a traumatic backdrop. The characters are haunted by the very present ghosts of traumatic violence. They act in a combination of perpetrating and suffering violence. In Manto's writing and work, next slide, trauma is encountered in a fourfold manner. First, Manto uses an economy of language and the literary framework. Several of his stories point to a use of language in a certain way. The linguistic framework is used in multiple ways to refer back to language. The puns, innuendo, and linguistic slippage that occurs seems to take place in order to point to a crisis of the signifying economy. I call these Manto's language games. Next slide. Second, these language games make way for not superficial linguistic play, but point to a rather deeper, more hidden subjectivity. In other words, these language games in Manto attest to a deeper interiority. Language games are not all surface and no symbol. They point rather to the deeper recesses of the psyche, collective social memory, and a traumatic engagement with symbolism. This traumatic engagement also shatters conventional discursive boundaries. The discourse between law, literature, and testimony is shattered in Manto's stories in the most quixotic of manners, hinting at traumatic depth. Next slide. Third, the language games that Manto plays seem to want to write on the body. There occurs an embodiment of language games such that trauma is understood in the somatic manifestations as well. Next slide. Fourth and finally, traumatic encounters with violence are used to reimagine subjectivity and thereby reinstate agency for the sufferers of bodily and sexual violence in Manto's story. Coming to the stories, the short story Colder Than Ice, within that story, the game of cards becomes metaphor and symbolism pointing to linguistic play. Time for a round of trumps becomes in the story a coded use of language to hint elsewhere at a sexual exchange between Ishwar Singh and Kalwant Kaur. Sexual games and games of language are combined and result in a metaphorical game of cards. However, the innuendo goes further. On the protagonist not being able to perform sexually with Kalwant Kaur, the former loses the plot. Ishra Sainya says Kalwant Kaur languidly, "You have shuffled me enough, it is time to produce your trump." Ishwar Singh fell as if the entire deck of cards had slipped from his hand onto the floor. This postponement of meaning, the exchange of the phallus for a game of cards, further encoded in a linguistic game, along with the final metaphor of the deck of cards slipping, point to slippage in language and the very phallocentric language itself. This slippage then becomes a useful tool to explain the traumatic fate that has caused Ishwar Singh to rape what turned out to be a dead woman's body. The linguistic and metaphoric play plays with the idea of trauma as well. Ishwar Singh is traumatized as his bodily reaction of being colder than ice repeat the moment of throwing the trump reveals. However, this idea then carries the dead woman's trauma onto the perpetrator. It shows the mark of the traumatic repetition, the compulsion to repeat the moment of the traumatic encounter. Yet, this is an encounter quite like Tancred, which shows the perpetrator as traumatized and the violent victim as dead. Yet, unlike Freud's reading of Tancred's traumatic exchange, where Tancred is read as the victim, Manto reads onto the perpetrator's body a death-like merging of the dead woman's body. The statement that the story ends with, "it was cold as ice," could refer both to Ishwar Singh's hand as well as the dead body. Coming to Toba Tek Singh, the mysterious gibberish that the protagonist speaks also becomes a language in itself. The utterance Upar the Gurgur, the annex, the Be Dhyan, the Mungdal of the Laltain is mentioned in the first incident of its occurrence. In the second incident, it becomes Upar the Gurgur, the annex, the Be Dhyan, the Mungdal of the government of Pakistan. The replacement of Laltain with another, the government of Pakistan, is later replaced with the government of Toba Tek Singh. This gibberish by a mentally ill man used to hint at the non-rationality of meaning-making itself. As the reader attempts to read the change in gibberish's code, the further the act of meaning-making seems to go, and it almost appears as if Manto is saying that to make sense in a time of collective failure, of sense itself is futile. This effect of language games and linguistic play carries on in the story. The last two sentences of the story state, "There behind the barbed wire, on the one side lay India, behind more barbed wire, on the other side lay Pakistan. In between, on a bit of earth which had no name, lay Toba Tek Singh." The
You have
madness
5 more minutes, Swati. Okay.
I'll quickly just finish this up.
Okay. No, it's okay. You
5 minutes
can
is
have
more than
5 minutes full.
yeah. The madness of the partition and the madness of Toba Tek Singh, the mentally ill man, come together in the double entendre. Toba Tek Singh is used playfully to refer both to the man who has died on the land as well as the land itself. It is almost as if the bureaucracy of the partition as an act of rationality is so rational that it hints at the irrationality of a meaning making at a time like this. My second and related argument is that this linguistic play is not superficial. Rather, the loaded metaphors and meanings hint at depth. This points to an interiority of the psyche and the harm done to the most interior corners of the mind. As an example, the believer's version story is an account provided by a first-person narrative of murder. Yet the discursive production of hate is looked at through depth of meaning. This happens by way of narrative. The narrator is telling a tale which is testimony. The testimony hints at interiority, something that Sudhir Kakkar says is lacking in the Indian mind. In fact, it refers to the story through which the narrator thought and did and provides the motive and action as well. Further, the discourse of testimony is a legal requirement and testimony is a moral claim as important for the psyche merge. This quixotic merging of boundaries hints at a non-rational ruptured order of things. It becomes a discourse of trauma different from the Western idea of madness as ordering and organizing civilization. This idea of discursive regime of modernity and its intertwining with the regime of fiction leads to a blurring of boundaries and binaries further. Another example of this merging happens in Mozaïl. The literary character of Mozaïl performatively indicates the fictionality of religious identities she swaddles her way in a curfew-hit region. She changes her clothes to change her identity, yet it is naked that she dies in a conflict, reinforcing the materiality of cultural identities. Her death is caused by the all too material communal madness that ensues in the wake of the partition. My third argument is also something that Mozaïl illustrates. Trauma is written on the body, showing the psychosomatic as well as violent ends of traumatic encounters. Mozaïl is killed in a case of mistaken identity that she helps engineer, yet her ultimate end also hints at the traumatic end to which violence is put. Even in Toba Tek Singh, the protagonist has swollen legs, the effect of not having sat down since the madness began. The effect of trauma in the body is also illustrated by Manto in Kholdo. The sexual violence on Sakina's body and mind, on Soma and Psyche, is hinted by another language game. The multivalent sense of the command given at the end of the story, when the doctor says, "open it," or Kholdo, indicating the window, the traumatized Sakina imagines the command to refer to her salwar and enacts the repetition of the original trauma. Here, trauma is encoded in language in a linguistic play of double meaning, as well as encoded in the body. And fourth and finally, I'll wrap this up. For Manto's Games of Trauma, he reimagines the subject even within traumatic encounters with violence. The sufferers of bodily and sexual violence in Manto's stories are reimagined to give reinstatement of their agency. In Kholdo, it is Sakina's father's utterance willing her to live. This is Rajeshwari Sundar Rajan's point. But similarly, in Mozail, the agency, even in death, comes from Mozail's wish to save Kirpal Kaur for Trilochan. So summing up, these four arguments about linguistic play, about depth and interiority, about ruptured boundaries, and about reimagining the traumatic subject lay bare the sites for trauma theory that Manto provides. As Shiv Vishwanathan states, it is time we see as storytellers as theorists, and it is time to learn from Manto, the literary theorist. It is time we studied the traumatic core at the heart of the partition, not just as an imposition of Western psychoanalytic models, but to use a traveling theory and have it re-emerge as different in a vernacular context. Just as in Freud's account, literature is used to signal Freud's limit, literature, Manto's stories in another context, can be the beginning of a new strand of trauma theory, one interspersed in vernacular forms of knowledge and meaning making of difficult and violent events. I'll stop here.
Thank you. Wonderful, Swati. You just stopped bang on time. So I hand over now to the rapporteurs who would be, reading out the questions that are there.
Thank you, Dr. Swatie, for that very insightful paper. I have two questions and comments for you. The first one is from Ishita Singh, and she appreciates your wonderful presentation. And then she asks you, do Manto's language games differ when the violence is inflicted by the state as opposed to the violence in the private or domestic? Does the linguistic register change with the spatial and temporal changes? Would you like to respond to that? And then I can ask the next question.
Yes. I think the idea in Manto is that the state as well as the private domestic are two realms which intermingle, just as I was talking about how discursive boundaries intermingle. And instead of an order of things, there is an intermingling of the state. So in Manto's stories, you don't have the state saying, let's murder. It comes from people. It comes from people deciding to do something. And for instance, if you listen to Manto, he says, even with his interaction with his peers, he says, I could have murdered you not now, but I could have murdered you then. So it's not as if the state is acting on the violence. It is the idea of the state through the domestic, through the private, that the violence is enacted.
Thank you. I have another question here from Professor Zedi. She's writing, how do you relate trauma and its articulation in Manto's stories to study the relationship between vernacular and dominant language? Is this to you a paradigm to understand the processes of vernacularization?
That's a good question. Since we've looked at the complexity of the vernacular and the processes involved, I would only go as far as a generalization can be made about the vernacular versus trauma. I only want to say two things. The first is that it becomes important to address the primal cries of trauma in one's mother tongue. So that is one thing, that it seems almost organic to say ouch basically in one's mother tongue. The other thing that I could say is that I'm looking at this interspersion of within trauma as structured like a language. So this idea that as you have a parallel model with the dominant language and the vernaculars, and the vernaculars sort of fighting back, I see this as the local paradigm of trauma theory fighting back the context of the dominant paradigm of trauma. So that is all I can say.
Right. We have some more questions for you. This is from Dr. Varadharaj, and it says, since the term vernacular with reference to spatiality remains an ideological controversy in the writings of Manto, where can we locate the trauma represented by him?
Will it be on the sufficient language component or on the issues which he attempted to emphasize?
I think language is an important part of his writing. And I try to point that out through double entendres, through linguistic slippage, that you can't ignore the writing and the language, the linguistic component of that writing. The issues itself, of course, are important, but those issues are coming to you through language and writing. So I would say that it is not insufficient. It is a very inextricable part of Manto's work to study the language component as well. Yeah.
Right, thank you. There's another question from Meenakshi, and she writes, Dr. Swatie, where do you situate silence in trauma articulation via language games?
That's also interesting because silence speaks more in trauma than perhaps in language games. But it's something that I would want to think about more. Where do I situate silence? Because in Manto, the dog, for instance, is silent. So you have a lot of these characters bringing on a lack of agency through silence. But again, this is something that I would want to think more about. Yeah.
Tanvi is writing, do you agree many psychological expression changes in translation from vernacular to English?
Yes, sometimes they could, sometimes they couldn't. It depends on the translation. Again, not an expert of translation whatsoever, but I would say that the primal cry of trauma is perhaps more organically understood in the language in which it is originally received. So in that sense, I would say that there is an authentic dimension to articulating that in the original language rather than the translation. Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Swati. These are all the questions and the comments that we have for you right now. And now maybe we can move on to the next presentation.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Swati, for brilliant kind of engagement with all the questions. Now, I just want to, before we go on to the next paper, I just want to go back to the question of Meenakshi Yadav, where one is looking at, I mean, how does one situate silence in trauma articulation via language games, in which I would like to suggest that the non-verbal modes of language is also a mode of articulation. And there we need to rethink the question of what do we define as language. And in that sense, you see gestural language or kinesics becomes an important component, which in the literary text is an abstract play of language, which we cannot find it concretized. We find that language getting re-articulated, reimagined in our conceptual framework or in our conceptual world. Now, we move to the next presentation. It is by Nandini Kalita, who is a Ph.D. scholar and teaching assistant in literature in the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences at IIT Delhi. And her paper is titled Becoming Assamese Language, Identity and Anxiety. So welcome, Nandini. Please, we are looking forward to your paper.
Thank you, ma'am. Ma'am, am I audible?
You are.
Right.
And good to see you again.
Thank you, ma'am. The centrality of the issue of identity in contemporary politics in Assam hints at a kind of deep-rooted anxiety about loss of identity, which has taken the shape of subnational dissent, xenophobia, or cultural isolation at several instances. In the course of this paper, I want to examine to what extent this anxiety is linked to the fear of losing the Assamese language. My inquiry into the question of identity is not informed by the assumption that identities are either fixed or stable. Assuming that language is the site where our sense of self and identity are continually constructed and performed, I will try to underline some crucial points in the ongoing process of the construction of the Assamese identity. I plan to understand the specificities of the link between identity and language in Assam by tracing two originary movements in the formation of the Assamese identity. The first one is the advent of Neo-Vaishnavism, and the next one is British annexation of Assam. Despite the postmodern insistence that search for origin is futile, I want to argue that without seeking an origin, one cannot fully understand the symbolic aspect of any historical or cultural context. I would like to point out that I use the word origin here in the Benjaminian sense of the term. As Benjamin describes in The Origin of German Tragic Drama, origin, although an entirely historical category, has nevertheless nothing to do with genesis. The term origin is not intended to describe the process by which the existent came into being, but rather to describe that which emerges from the process of becoming and disappearance. Before proceeding any further, I want to clarify here that though I attempt to identify two originary movements in the construction of the Assamese identity, the aim of this paper is not to claim that these are the only constitutive movements. As Benjamin has pointed out that, on one hand, origin is a process of restoration and re-establishment, but on the other hand, it is also something imperfect and incomplete. Acknowledging this paradox amounts to accepting that there can never be fixed originary movements, and by focusing on some, we shall just have a fragment of the whole. But as we have learned from Benjamin, any reading of origin can only be fragmentary. The idea behind identifying certain key movements in the history of the region and examining how they shape the contours of the Assamese identity is to prove that identity construction is an ongoing process. The region in the last few decades has witnessed severe intensification of identity politics, which has culminated in violence at several instances. It has been noticed that most of the xenophobic narratives circulating in the region that villainizes outsiders presuppose an essence at the core of the Assamese identity. The idea of the Ohomia Manu in such narratives figures as a fixed and coherent category. In this paper, I want to propose that one of the most important originary movements in the construction of the Assamese identity is the emergence of Neo-Vaishnavism in the region. It was Shankardeva who initiated the new Vaishnavite movement in Assam in the 15th century. The religion that he propagated accorded primacy to bhakti. Sensing that the Brahminical pretensions have caused a rift between man and God, he endeavored to initiate a new religion based on Neo-Vaishnavite ideals with the concept of bhakti at its core. According to him, it is only through bhakti the spiritual realization of the Supreme is possible. The Neo-Vaishnavite movement set the stage for construction of the Assamese cultural identity. The region is home to many different tribal groups with their own distinct religious and cultural practices. One of the obvious outcomes of Shankardeva's movement was assimilation of many such groups like the Morans, the Kacharis, the Deoris into the emerging Neo-Vaishnavite religion, which was becoming increasingly popular in the region. Before the advent of Shankardeva's reformist Vaishnavism, there existed different cults of worship in the Brahmaputra Valley. Shaivism, Shaktism, and Tantrism were extremely popular. By the time Shankardeva appeared in the scene, Assam was politically divided among different ruling groups. Constant strife for supremacy among these powers led to unrest in the society. Shankardeva's religion, to which anyone could be initiated, irrespective of their caste or religion, emerged as a unifying force. He offered the possibility of radical restructuring of the society along more ethical lines. Shankardeva's religion appealed to people due to several reasons. Instead of Sanskrit, Shankardeva used an easily accessible language to spread the tenets of Neo-Vaishnavism. His religion did not require the devotees to perform elaborate rituals. It stressed primarily upon devotion of the devotee for his God. The practice of giving sarana to those who were willing to enter the fold of Neo-Vaishnavism played a very crucial role in the process of assimilation of different communities into the Hindu society. The pace of assimilation quickened in the coming times. The adoption of the Hindu faith by the Ahom kings and the active patronage of Hinduism in the 17th century hastened the assimilation of many tribes into the Hindu fold, and the idea of a composite Assamese identity began to emerge. The role of self-other relationship in the process of identity construction cannot be stressed enough. Identity can be defined as a process which involves both identifying the self and being recognized by the other. Levinas talks about the role of the other in the founding of selfhood. However, unlike the imperialist project of defining the self in terms of its difference from the other, the Levinasian idea considers response of the self to the other to be a constitutive principle of the self. He links ethics to this very response. In fact, for him, ethics is calling into question of my spontaneity by the presence of the other. For Levinas, the self always must be inclined towards the other as nothing but the response to, but as it is nothing but that response to the other. It naturally follows from Levinas's argument that the realm of ethics can be reached only by entering a dialogic situation. Recognizing the importance of language as the field where dialogic exchanges can take place, Levinas notes in the section titled Discourse and Ethics in its Totality and Infinity. Language presupposes interlocutors, a plurality. Their commerce is not a representation of one by the other, not a participation in universality on the common plane of language. Their commerce, as we shall show shortly, is ethical. I want to argue that ethics in Shankardeva's philosophy too is linked to the awareness of the other. Throughout his various writings, he stressed on the ongoing obligation towards the other. He doesn't talk about renouncing the world, but goes on to give a detailed account of how one should treat others. I want to suggest that his religious order represented a space where the self could enter into a dialogic encounter with the other, as it doesn't rely upon marginalization of some other to derive its stability. Now we come to the next constitutive movement, which is the British annexation of Assam. Tea is considered to be a very important part of British culture. I want to point out that tea did not appear in the country until not very long ago. The Chinese had been consuming this beverage long before the Europeans encountered it. It is only in the 17th century that the Dutch, French, and Portuguese acquired the taste of tea and introduced the British to the drink. The popularity of Chinese tea among the British, along with the disinclination of the Chinese to trade with them, led to severe trade imbalances. The Opium Wars, in a way, are direct outcomes of the anxiety of the empire of dependency, as writer Amitabh Ghosh has beautifully shown in his Ibis trilogy. The British tried to address this fear of dependency by looking for alternative sources of tea. In its bid to challenge the Chinese monopoly on tea, the British Empire in the early 19th century began large-scale production of tea in the northeastern state of Assam, which came under their rule in 1826 according to the Yangabu Treaty. The region that is known as Northeast today existed as a set of separate independent provinces. It is after a series of British conquests the region became a part of the Pan-Indian imperial formation and came to be known as Assam. The history of tea production in the Northeast shows that contours of the policies of the empire with respect to both boundaries and administration of the region were shaped to a large extent by one strategic consideration, which was maximization of profit. No importance was attributed to the complex issues of historical and cultural continuity by the colonial administrator. The colonial intervention, which ensured incorporation of the region into the larger market system, also caused an enormous demographic shift. As the local peasantry was reluctant to work in these plantations, the British actively encouraged immigrants to the region to meet their labor needs. According to Guha, the colonial state created the conditions for the growth of Assamese consciousness, first by encouraging immigration into the region and later by imposing Bengali as the official language. This created a sense of paranoia among the people. They began to fear that they would be marginalized in their own land. The decisions and policies of the colonial administration, based primarily on economic concerns, shaped the cultural politics of the region to a great extent, and its consequences continue to unfold in the post-colonial era. I want to claim that the colonial administration contributed towards the growth of identity politics in Assam in a major way. However, it is not simply because they encouraged immigration to the region. It is because they failed to take into consideration the historical and cultural specificities either of the inhabitants of the region or of those who migrated to the region. As I have stated a little earlier, construction of the other is crucial for the constitution of self. There can be no sense of identity without recognition by the other. This possibility of recognition was outside the realm of any possibility for the colonized subject. This resulted in a kind of serious identity crisis in the Assamese context. There were two kinds of outcome of this crisis. On one hand, there was extreme identification with the colonizer. Without an adequate sense of self, the colonized subject, in many instances, relied on the colonizer for his or her sense of identity. On the other hand, it gave rise to a deep concern with the question of Assamese identity. There are several examples where both of the aspects of this crisis can be seen in one person. Anandaram Dhekial Phukon was born in a Brahmin landowner family and educated in the Hindu College of Calcutta. He believed in the regenerative role of British rule and remained a loyal government subject until his death. He was extremely impressed by England's material progress and hoped for similar progress in Assam. Interestingly, Bhekial Phukan was also deeply preoccupied with the development of Assamese language and identity. He played a very important role in the battle for due recognition of Assamese as a distinct and separate language after the language had lost its rightful place to Bengali in local schools and court in 1837.
Nandini, you have 5 more minutes, okay?
Right,
Take your time, 5 more minutes.
Right. Bhekial Phukan remains an extremely important figure in the history of Assamese literature. He once wrote an article called Englander Vivaron, which, as the name itself suggests, is an account of England. His fascination with England becomes glaringly obvious in the text when he repeatedly stresses on the need for civilization in Assam. Bhekial Phukan's narrative reveals that the dominant discourse of the colonizer's superiority shaped the contours of his relationship with his motherland to a great extent. Such ambivalence towards the colonial rule was exhibited by many others like Gyanaviram Borua, Gunaviram Borua, etc. Figures like Anandaram Bhekial Phukan and Gyanaviram Borua, who were from the elite section of the society, played a very decisive role in the process of identity construction in the Assamese context. I want to suggest that their engagement with this process was shaped by the discourse of civilization that came in the wake of colonization to a great extent. The discourse of civilization went on to shape the nature of relationship between different communities of Assam as well and still continues to do so. Members of several communities are routinely otherized within the society even now. Assam has posed a major challenge in the modern project of nation building. A great number of secessionist groups are involved in protracted armed struggle against the state demanding freedom in the region. One cannot stress enough on the role of identity question in these multiple insurgencies. There is a widespread anxiety of losing language and identity in the region in the face of confrontation with the homogenizing forces of nation building. In certain instances, such anxieties have resulted in the formation of militant groups like the Alpha, BLD, etc. Because when a group experiences marginalization of its identity, it may exhibit the tendency to assert its identity with a vengeance. This concern over identity has also led to the rise of xenophobia, which has claimed many lives in the region. The situation has worsened in the era of neoliberal globalization. Many scholars have delineated that one of the most obvious outcomes of globalization is cultural homogenization. The sense of anxiety over loss of language and identity has intensified as a result of the rapid changes that came in the wake of globalization. Discourses of otherization of immigrants are becoming increasingly popular. There have been several instances of extreme violence against immigrants in the state. Alpha and some other militant outfit operating in the region banned Hindi films in the state in 2002. According to those militant outfits, Hindi cinema poses a serious threat to Assamese culture. Then again in 2014, Alpha imposed a ban on Hindi movie songs during Bihu celebrations. In 2018, a Bollywood singer was attacked by some members in the audience for singing a Hindi song. All these examples highlight the fear, paranoia, and insecurity in certain sections of the society about erosion of the Assamese identity. A mode of identity construction that relies on marginalization of other groups have become dominant in the region. I want to conclude by saying that it is the need of the movement to critically re-examine the question of identity and the role of language in construction and contestation of identities. Unless the issue of anxiety about identity loss is addressed, the region will remain in the shadow of violence. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nandini, for a brilliant kind of presentation. So I would request the rapporteurs to take over now for the questions.
Thank you, Nandini, for your wonderful paper. I have two questions here. The first one is from Dr. Bharadraj. He is writing, is there a possibility of attributing the dominant presence of unique homogeneity in the vernacular language for causing anxiety and identity crisis?
Sorry, can you please repeat the question?
Is there a possibility for attributing the dominating presence of unique homogeneity in vernacular language for causing anxiety and identity crisis?
Right, right. I mean, the question of recognition becomes very important here because, I mean, identity construction relies on recognition to a great extent because recognition is something that manages relationship between the self and the other. So, I mean, without that, this wouldn't be possible. So, I think that would be a very important step towards that.
Right, Ruchi. How does the resistance to dominant language by vernacular alters the Assamese identity, and how is it different from other such contestations?
Uh, right. I mean, what I was trying to argue is that identity is never fixed. It's something that's constantly changing. Identity is something that's not owned, that's constantly performed, and language is the site where this is performed. So there is no fixed Assamese identity in that sense. So I mean, this change will continuously take place. So I mean, so so as long as we accept that, I think, I mean, there would be, I mean, there would be a kind of decrease in the xenophobic attitude that the region has been exhibiting towards outsiders. I mean, I think it's very important to accept that, I mean, identities are not fixed. They are, I mean, indeterminate and fuzzy and fluid and constantly changing.
I have here from Kalita. She's writing, Nandini, could you speak a little on the impact of Likhito language on identity construction of other varieties?
Impact of?
Likhito language.
Right. Yes, yes. So I mean, so Assam is home to different ethnic groups, and I mean, there are various groups and there are various languages, and even like even within the state, I mean, there is a kind of hierarchy between different languages. I mean, Assamese isn't the only language. There is Boro, there is Khasi, there is like host of other languages. So there is this hierarchy, I mean, that exists, among these languages, and also, I mean, in Assamese language, I mean, there is this kind of division between Likhito and Kothito, where Likhito is supposed to be, somewhat more refined than Kothito. So I mean, undoubtedly, this such hierarchies should be questioned and problematized.
Um, that is all I think we have for you. I'll hand over back to Anuradha, ma'am.
Okay, so Nandini, my query to you is somewhat a little different. It pertains to the argument that you're making in your paper. I mean, are you positing the becoming of Assamese-ness in a historical time frame? I mean, you look at the uh, colonial phase and you try to posit the time of the rise of new Vaishnavite, impinging of new Vaishnavite identities, and then you're talking of contemporary Assam. So, in what way are you looking at the becoming of Assamese-ness in a historical time? Is that what your question is?
Right, ma'am. I mean, that's what I try to foreground my paper in a way to show that how identities are historically constructed. I mean, the idea was to delineate the constructedness of the question of identity. I mean, how it isn't something that's fixed. I mean, how it's something indeterminate and is constantly performed. I mean, even at this moment, I mean, I mean, identities are constantly shifting and changing. And so I tried to locate 2 points in history, I mean, which had a decisive role in shaping the contours of like the Assamese identity. But I'm not at all claiming that these are the only two movements. I mean, are the most important movements. There are several others, but I decided to focus on two.
Okay. Okay, so thank you, Nandini. Now we move on to the third speaker of the day. That is B.R. Shrikanth, who is a Ph.D. scholar in the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences, IIT Bombay, Maharashtra. It is nice to hear IIT Bombay and not IIT Mumbai. So his paper is Revisiting a Construct, Reinventing a Cosmos. We look forward to your presentation, Shrikant. So over to you now.
Thank you, ma'am, and thank you all of you for giving us all this opportunity. And I'll also thank you for your patience. Just one quick thing. Given that this is the first draft, I'll be more excited to have suggestions and comments along with questions for the paper. I'll share my screen. Yes. All right. My paper, which is titled Revisiting a Construct, Reinventing a Cosmos, is analyzing K.V. Subbanna's reading of Kaviraja Marga. Now, what is Kaviraja Marga? Kaviraja Marga is the oldest and the first, as of now, available work in Kannada. This was produced in the Rashtrakuta era. Rashtrakutas were a dynasty who were ruling the Kannada-speaking region at that particular time. And this work is supposed to have been authored by Sri Vijaya, who was a poet in the court of Amogavarshan Ruputunga, who was the ruler, the Rashtrakuta ruler, who ruled between 814 and 877 AD. This work was first published by K.B. Pathak in 1898, and it has seen several reprints, several editions, and a large number of commentaries over the years. In fact, it has constantly aroused the interest of researchers in Kannada. And this work is a collection of 541 poems in 3 cantos, and it's basically dealing with alankaras. Apart from verses on alankaras, shabdalankara and arthalankara, this work also consists of verses on grammar, linguistics, poetic meter, Kannada land, language, community, culture, and politics. This work is also translated into English, and unless otherwise mentioned, all the references that I have made here are actually the way it has been used in the translated version, which is edited by Manu Chakravarti, and it's called Community and Culture. K.V. Subbanna published Kaviraja Marga Mattu Kannada Jagattu in the year 2000, and this is a work which is basically a collection of 3 essays dealing with the theme of Kannada cosmos and identity. Now, before I start talking about Kaviraja Marga, which of course is a pre-colonial text, and how does one engage with a text as such in the post-colonial era? Before getting into that, I would like to give a very quick summary of the Kannada literary public sphere in the final decades of the 20th century. Subbanna himself mentions some of the tensions that haunt the Kannada and the Indian society at large at the moment when he produced this work, and he places that as the context or the background which enabled his reading of the text Kaviraja Marga. Some of the things that he mentions are the partition of India, the struggle for linguistic states, and the separatist movements thereafter, and the disputes among the states in relation to border, river, water sharing, migration, and the separatist movements or the cries for separation within the Kannada speaking region in places like Kodagu or Coorg, Uttar Karnataka, Tulunadu, Karavali, which is the coastal area, and the Gokak agitation. Now, while these are the things that Subbanna mentions, I would like to identify 3 major moments or issues which brought about a sense of fissure or a tension in the Kannada community in the final decades of the 20th century. The first and perhaps the most important fissure was the Busa controversy, which happened in November 1973. For those of us who are slightly familiar with the Dalit movement in Karnataka, the Busa controversy must be a familiar term. Susitaru and Satyanarayana or D.R. Nagraj in Flaming Feet, or Prithvi Datta Chandra Shobi in his edition of collected works of D.R. Nagraj, all elaborately discuss this event, the Busa controversy. Uh, the Busa controversy was basically a minister in the Karnataka state cabinet, B. Basavlingappa, who was the minister for municipal administration and a member from the backward class, making this comment at a seminar in Ambedkar School of Thought at Mysore University, uh, which roughly can be translated in this fashion. Not everything in Kannada is substantial literature. There is also a lot of busa in it. Busa basically means anything that is not very stuffed, anything that is very loose as such. Now, what is interesting is the whole Busa controversy is premised on this one statement, but what most of the people often miss out is the continuation of this, where he also says one should have Kannada pride, speak in Kannada, build Kannada. However, studying English will develop the faculty of reason, independent attitude, and patriotism. If anyone draws the curtains of Kannada pride and asks not to study English, do not listen to them. So this was a moment, this was an event which very significantly prompted the backward classes to aspire for English. Uh, in fact, this is further illustrated by Tarakeshwar when he discusses language and caste, where he says that by the end of the 20th century, with industrialization and absence of jobs in the government sector, the need to have English uh, became only pertinent, and people realized this and aspired for English. So, what this event caused in the Kannada literary public sphere was a polarization between the Dalits and non-Dalits. So, the linguistic identity, which was celebrated barely few months ago when Karnataka gets renamed. It is called as Mysore and it is renamed as Karnataka only in 1972. Is facing the first major tension in the form of Busa controversy. And then in the 80s, there is the Gokak Chalwali or the Gokak report, where Karnataka makes an attempt to move away from this three language formula, which allows people to study Sanskrit. And the Devraj government, which intends to bring about a change in this system, goes out of power before it can implement this. And the Gundura government, which comes afterwards, does not show much interest in implementing this. And assuming that we Kru Gokak, who was supposedly very fond of Sanskrit, would recommend maintaining the status quo, they set up a committee. And Vikru Gokak, much to the dismay and amusement of the state government, recommends Kannada to be replaced, Sanskrit to be replaced by Kannada, not just as the first language, but as the sole first language. And this delay by the government to not implement this also further results in large scale rioting. And anyone who is little familiar with this will also know how it takes a different shape with Rajkumar, who was the Kannada matinee idol of the time. With his participation, it takes a different turn. Finally, the Kannada organizations and the Kannada nationalism at that time. one of the major debates that happen is with this uh, appointing or announcement of Hiremat, who was not a very established, or not, according to many, who was not even a writer, as the chairman of the Sahitya Sammelana in 1990. A lot of writers in Kannada expressed their uh, protest, and or a collective of these writers organized a parallel Sahitya Sammelana, and that is where they discuss this question of excellence, which then leads to another major debate in the Kannada literary public sphere, which eventually results in certain other publications, but that is a different trajectory altogether. But these Kannada organizations and groups had by then not had shown a certain sense of uh, there was a certain disappointment among the writers in Karnataka about the way it was functioning, and it had also assumed a certain militant nature, which kind of alarmed the people in Karnataka, because as we also see in Subarna and in the writings of many others of the time, even Janki Nair writes about this extensively. The kind of linguistic militant militancy that was displayed by the Shiva Sena in Maharashtra, or groups in Tamil Nadu, had also come in a very big fashion in Karnataka. And it is exactly at this juncture that one can locate Subarna's work. The fissures that haunting, the tensions that are prevalent in the Kannada community, the imagination of Kannada community at the time when Subarna produces this work. Like I said, the charm or the appeal that the whole idea of Kannada had during the time of state reorganization, or the unification of the state, or the renaming of the state, does not hold the same kind of glamour anymore. The identities that are based on caste and religion become more prominent. And then in this tussle amongst Hindi, Kannada, and Sanskrit, English emerges as a very safe winner, and everyone seemed to have absolutely no issues in accepting English. And the militant nature that both the public and the Kannada groups had displayed were seen as mass hysteria, were seen as not becoming of the Kannada culture. And in fact, D.R. Nagraj, in the article The Forms of Kannada Nationalism, analyzing the various forms of Kannada nationalism that existed at that time, says Karnataka is facing a big crisis in all its spheres: linguistic, community, cultural, economic, and political. But the solution to it does not lie in hating the other. The language of war is airness. The path of being universal through being distinctive is very hard, but it is the right path, not only from the perspective of present day politics, but also from the perspective of a truly humanist development. In fact, the other thing that happens around the same time is the uh, arrival of television. Now, of course, there is this riot which happens because of the broadcasting of the Urdu news in 1994. But apart from all these things, in fact, there have been very elaborate works on how television can be linked with the growth or the rise of the Hindutva ideology. But apart from all these things, for someone like Subarna, who was very actively invested in the communitarian art form of theater, this nuclearization of this space of entertainment was something which was very disturbing. So in this context, how does Subarna read Kaviraja Marga? Subarna, of course, does what every other critic, every other reader of Kaviraja Marga has done. He analyzes the content, he discusses the alankaras, he discusses the flaws in poetry that are mentioned in the first canto, the arthalankara in the second, the shabdalankaras in the third. But apart from that, what are the other things that Subarna reads? He locates Kaviraja Marga at the moment of Kannada Renaissance. He borrows from the work of M.M. Kalburgi and shows how Kaviraja Marga is that moment when Kannada had a certain renaissance. So, the most important trait of this period is the regime, Rashtrakuta regime of Amogavarshan Rupatunga.
Shrikanth, sorry to interrupt. You have 5 more minutes, okay?
Thank you. Uh, Focusing on stability rather than expansion and aggression. So the boundaries were settled, and the most famous and often quoted verse from Kaviraja Marga, from Kaveri to Godavari, becomes very important in this context. So he stresses on the network of the republic, state, and the king, which forms the crux of the introductory section. For Subarna, the introductory section is actually the exposition of the political, the cultural intention of the text. The other sections might be dealing with alankaras, but for him, these elements in the introduction form some very important observations about the period. He contrasts this work with Antonio Nebrija, who compiled Grammatica Castellana in Spain, and says that the project of regulating language in a definite constructed form, which was characteristic of Nebrija, is different from what Kaviraja Marga does, where it does not insist that language should be consciously formed as a monolithic constructed entity. So the other important observation that Subarna makes about this work is the location of Tirul Kannada. Tirul is the kernel. The Kannada's kernel is located in a region which is quite far from the Rashtrakuta capital, Manyaketa. So further, Subarna elaborates on how this triumvirate of the republic, state, and the king becomes an ideal model of governance, of polity, even to our times. And then he picks on the important terms and concepts like Kasavara and Vasudha Valaya Vilina, which speak of a certain inclusiveness, tolerance, and an emotionally knit unit, despite not being a political unit. And he points them out as significant things within the text. What Subarna does is he places this text as a text which demonstrates a greater amount of wisdom or viveka in the moment of crisis vis-a-vis the present situation, where despite having many sort of assurances and stabilities which the time of Amogavarshan Rupatunga did not have, the responses have not been very wise. What are the implications of Subarna's reading? Now, to understand Subarna's reading, one must also pay attention to what Subarna's activity was in a very larger fashion. He was instrumental in managing the theater organization called Ninasam, which is placed in Hegodu, and repeatedly in their brochures and various other publications, we see the desire to strive and produce excellent plays, bring the best of the world to the people, strive for the artistic and there is no antagonism, or there is no sense of resistance to works from other languages. In fact, they take in fact they showcase that each of their productions every year will comprise a play from one of the Indian languages outside Kannada, and one of the plays outside India, and a Kannada play. So what are the major implications of this? Firstly, I'll just take 2 more minutes and wind this up. Firstly, KV Subarna locates the origin or the source of Kannada conscious in Kaviraja Marga, which is a shift from the Vijayanagara kingdom, which people like Chidananda Murthy through Kannada Shakti Kendra were very aggressively portraying. Vijayanagara, the golden era of Kannada, the the ruins which was because of Muslim invasion and the demonizing of the other, all of this does not appeal, and therefore Subarna makes the shift to Kaviraja Marga, and thereby makes an interesting move in terms of the politics. And there is also an appeal for the politics of restraint. So the curious thing about this is this politics of restraint can also be seen as something that has a quality of appropriating resistance, of becoming so inclusive that any voice that makes an attempt to resist any large narrative will still be considered as part of Kannada identity. In fact, the other thing about this is also the thrust on moving away from this aggression, from this militant Kannada nationalism, and D.R. Nagaraj's uh, afterward to Siddhalingaya's autobiography titled The Power of Poor People's Laughter, in fact, stresses on how Siddhalingaya's autobiography is unique because of its element of humor and not merely resting on the story of trauma and deception and various other things that one usually associates with a text like Dalit autobiography. So Subarna's larger attempt here is also to speak of a power center which need not also function as the center of culture. So this is also move away from Bangalore, because much of the Kannada activism, much of what was happening was centered on Bangalore. This whole thrust on English was also happening in Bangalore. So here, Subarna also makes this move to think of a cultural center which is far from the power center. I stop here. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Shrikanth. Uh, I was on the verge of interrupting you, but you ended on that note. So now we would like to invite questions, and I hand over again to Aditi and her co-rapporteur.
Thank you, Shrikanth, for that wonderful discussion. For the paucity of time, I'll just read out 2 questions to you, and maybe you can answer the rest in the chat box later. So I have a question here from Professor Nishad Zaidi, and she's asking, how did Kannada movement draw from language movements in India? What was Subarna's take about colonial vernacularization of Indian languages?
How did Kannada movement draw from language movements in India? What was Subarna's take about colonial vernacularization of in fact, the Kannada movement till about the nationalist period sort of coincides with the nationalist movements. Uh, if one looks at the trajectory of the rise of Kannada nationalism or the Kannada movement, one sees that it starts, especially in the realm of theatre, in opposition to the rising influence of Marathi in the northern part of Karnataka. So it becomes a very conscious task for the intellectuals in Karnataka at that time. People like Dara Bendre, who travel around Karnataka and also contribute to the establishment of various organizations like Karnataka Vidyavardhaka Sangha or Kannada Sanghas in Bangalore, Mysore, and Shimoga at various points in time. So the model, the usage of print, the print culture, the publications, it sort of coincides with the larger occurrences in the country. What was Subarna's take about colonial vernacularization of Indian languages? Subarna does not have a very um, you know, for Subarna, the anxiety about what will happen to the language is not so much there. For him, it is what can one do with the language. There is, for Subarna, this possibility of mutual coexistence. In fact, in the 2000s, at the end of the century, one can see renewed interest in these Gandhian approaches, where you speak of a very inclusive system, which is premised on this idea of dialogue, and there is no anxiety per se about what has happened, because what Subarna also feels is that as a language, it is capable of withstanding, or rather enduring all these transactions.
Thank you. I have another question here from Professor Harder, and he's asking, more generally speaking, is it your project to study the projection and negotiation of literary heritage in the context of sub-national, provincial nationalism in Karnataka?
Is your project studying in the context of sub-national, provincial nationalism?
I mean, that's a really big question. So
Yeah. I'm just reading it. If I
answer
can just
briefly here and type the rest on the chat box, because we are clearly running out of time here.
Or these dealings with heritage. In fact, Subarna does make a comparison between the Tamil classical text Tolkappiyam and Kavirajamarga here. But for Subarna, the invocation of Tamil pride is more in terms of the militancy it is showing in contemporary times. And what Subarna also does is, when he compares Tolkappiyam with Kaviraja Marga, he sees a greater potential in Kaviraja Marga in terms of the uh, um, insights it offers with regard to politics, whereas for him, Tolkappiyam is not something which, also perhaps because he does not really read the Tamil version of Tolkappiyam and relies on secondary sources.
Uh, Thank you, Shrikanth, for your wonderful paper and the responses to the questions. With this, we come to the end of our first session for the day. And I would like to thank all the paper presenters and our chair, Anuradha ma'am, for being there with us. And I would now hand this over to Kashish.